I'm very happy to have Edith V from Laws.Africa Association. And the main topic is AKN for Africa, and I leave the floor to her. Thank you.
Hi, Monica. Thank you so much for that introduction.
Thank you to you for coming. It's a great pleasure to have you. And, you know, my heart is in Africa, you know very well. So yeah. Welcome.
Almost sunny Cape Town. Okay, I'm just sharing my screen. Cool. I think you can see the right one. Hi, my name is Edith. I'm with Laws.Africa. We are a nonprofit based at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Our mission is to make African legislation more readily available. And who I am is on the team, I bridge the gap between our content and development teams with a specific focus on using AKN day to day. Cool. So what I'll be talking about today is the AKN for Africa recommendation that we published a little earlier this year. So what it is a technical recommendation for implementers like ourselves. And so far it covers how to apply the AKN naming convention for generating FRBR URIs for African documents in particular. So we obviously, as our scope grew of the different types of documents that we mark up and digitize, we obviously started with the base naming convention as our first resource. When we started looking at resources like the AKN for UN and AKN for EU guidelines for more particular advice. But there was no AKN for Africa, so we wrote that because it didn't exist. We do think that it's important that as adoption grows in Africa, the naming convention should be applied as consistently as possible so that we can reference and dereference each other's documents with a fairly high accuracy. Cool. So what I'll be doing is just talking through each of the elements of the FRBR URI and just pointing out a couple of examples of questions and concerns that we had as we marked up more documents and more document types. So before I dive in, our guiding principles in writing the recommendation and in general as we apply AKN is obviously the uniqueness, consistency, and replicability requirements of the naming convention to make it make sense and make it work. I won't go over why those are important. I think we're all on the same page there. But also respecting local traditions, by which I mean giving users and practitioners what they expect. So if they're used to referring to documents in a certain way, trying to incorporate that into the FRBR URI wherever possible. And I'll point out some examples as we go of where that is possible and where it isn't. So the first element of the FRBR URI that we encountered some questions with was the place. So the 2-letter country code followed by the locality code. Some pretty straightforward examples, Mombasa County in Kenya. We use the KE ISO country code, and 001 is assigned by the government for that county. So nice and straightforward. Similarly, in South Africa, the Matakama municipality in the Western Cape, we use the ZA, which is the South Africa country code, and WC001 is the government assigned municipality code. But but as we went further afield and started looking at, for example, things from ECOWAS. So for those of you who don't know, we have some regional bodies in Africa for different parts of it, as well as the African Union, which obviously applies to all of Africa. So the ECOWAS, for example, is it's an organization or a body, sorry, that that has Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, and I think it has 15 member states, and it works to promote economic integration in West Africa. So an example of a document that they would produce is a directive on the organization of the regional electricity market. And our first question there was, okay, what do we use as the locality or the country code? It's not scoped to a country. But importantly, all these different bodies not only inform legislation in their member states, where they would either, adopt a model law as is appropriate to them, but also
There is a problem of audio, maybe. Can Edith check, please? Your mic? Someone can hear?
I think she lost connection completely.
Edith, can you check the video if it is connected with the audio? So I think it's better to close the connection. If oh, okay, now it's coming. Okay, again. Hello, Edith. Can you hear me, Edith?
Hi.
Hi. So come back. Yes, we lose you.
Yes, I noticed there were some comments that I was mute, but I wasn't sure at what point I cut out.
Okay. So in the presentation of the XML examples. Okay.
Okay. Cool. Did you hear the part about the country codes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, cool. So it's just the last bit there. Awesome. Okay, so doc type, subtypes. I'm so sorry for that interruption. I was talking about how we decided what to group under ACT versus what we decide to group under statement, which we used the base AKN naming convention guidelines on. So if there was, if something is sometimes normative and sometimes more like guidance, we would include it under statement, and we would always include it under statement rather than doing it on a case-by-case basis. And yeah, we decided to do that just for consistency, especially as there will be multiple people working in this space across the continent. So we thought keeping it consistent would be a good idea. So this was based on all the regional bodies that we had access to documents of. For national and subnational, which is where we started, you'll see that first of all, we only looked at acts or at act type documents because we only look at gazetted texts, which all have the force of law. And you might notice that some of these are abbreviated and some of them aren't, whereas for the regional doc types and subtypes, we don't abbreviate subtypes ever. So we decided not to do that because there aren't necessarily common across the entire continent abbreviations for these different types of documents. So we thought just keep it clear and simple. It might lead to slightly longer FRBR URIs, but it will lead to less confusion. When we initially started, we sort of abbreviated without even really interrogating it because the abbreviations are so widely used. No one says statutory instrument, so we use SI. But we have come up against a couple of issues where provincial notice was encountered first in South Africa and much more commonly. And then a year or two later, we encountered Premier's notice for the first time. So we couldn't use PN, so we used a slightly different abbreviation. So this is all just to say, like, a slight word of warning against abbreviating. It might, at the end of the day, be worth just spelling out all the subtypes. So for bylaw, decree, and statute, we don't abbreviate those in any case because they don't have a commonly known abbreviated form. Cool. And as I mentioned a little earlier, we keep the same subtype with the same doc type always. So we'll never have a model law under the ACT doc type, and we'll never have guidelines under the ACT doc type, for example. And as I said, that's just to keep it consistent. So even if you could make a case that a specific document does in fact have the force of law, or doesn't in a weird edge case, we would still use the same doc type that is expected, so that we have that replicability, predictability that the naming convention relies on. Cool. So moving on to author. We only include the author when it's not the default author. So in South Africa, the default author is the National Assembly. They promulgate all the legislation. So we never mention National Assembly as the author in South Africa, as an example. But at the African Union, the committee is the default author, but the Commission on Human and People's Rights also authors quite a lot of their documents. So there we would include the abbreviated form of that body as the author, to distinguish it from the default. And here, again, we abbreviate the ones that are super well known, very common. Everyone knows that OAU is Organization of African Unity. But for the more niche departments and people will spell it out, which again is going to lead to longer URIs, but less confusing ones, because AUCDREA would mean nothing to anyone. Cool. For the year, we use just the year, not the full date. For national legislation, we use the officially assigned year. So we'll often have an act number year pairing, or always, but often towards the end of the year, it'll be Act 32 of 2019, but it only ends up getting published at the start of 2020 once the government printers are back at work. But we still would keep 2019 as the Act year. Not only because it's the official assignment, which is important, but also because then we don't end up with numbering clashes down the line once Act 32 of 2020 is finally published as well. For regional legislation, because it's not always gazetted, it's almost never gazetted, and it's sometimes officially published in some form or another, but not consistently enough for us to use those dates. We use the year of adoption instead, which every document has. And then in the very, very rare cases where a document has been published, but it maybe doesn't have any member state signatories to it, so it was never adopted, but it's still being published. Very, very rare. I think we've come across one or two of those. We will use ND, which is part of the base naming convention as well. Numbers where, yeah, we've come up against some of the most interesting edge cases. So clerical errors do happen, especially last year in South Africa. There were hundreds of notices published per week around the different departments managing with the whole COVID thing. And yeah, the government printers were working at a pace that was that they certainly weren't used to. So we had quite a few of these where several notices were published with the same number, or yeah, government departments that aren't used to drafting regulations were suddenly doing that. So we sort of worked around that, or worked with it, where we have multiple notices with the same number. We just tack B and C, etc., onto the end of the subsequent numbers. Yeah. For For chapter numbers, which are very commonly used in a lot of countries in Africa, we don't use those as part of the FRBR URI, even though they are expected by practitioners, because firstly, they get reassigned and reused, so they're not unique. And not all acts have them. So their acts only get a chapter number once they've been included in the main collection for that country as decided by their main publisher. But yeah, we can't use something that isn't there for everything to inform the URI. So we use the act number year to inform the URI, but we do capture the chapter number as well and keep that separately in the database. And that is also useful for dereferencing, because that is often how they're referred to. So we don't throw away that information, we just don't use it in the URI because it's not fit for that purpose. One exception to that is in Namibia, we've got 3 or 4 acts that I think came from England in the 1800s. We know for sure that it's chapter 65, and that's kind of all we know about it. We have the text, but we don't really have access to when and how it was published, what the act number was, whether England was using act numbers in 1814. So there, of course, we'd rather use cap 65 because that is the information that we do have. But yeah, that's a rare exception. We do have plenty of documents that don't have a number, especially at the regional level. But yeah, so the constitutions in Namibia and South Africa, we use constitution for that rather than because they're unnumbered acts. Sometimes regulations, well, this was actually a clerical error because ministerial orders should have a number, but it didn't have one. So we give it a descriptive title instead. We don't repeat the subtype. So even though ministerial order was in the title of it, we're not going to include that in the number because it's included as the subtype. And COVID-19 wasn't in the title, but it definitely was about that. So we included that. And for bylaws in South Africa, they most often don't have a number. So we always use a short phrase there. Again, we don't repeat the locality or the word bylaw. We try to keep it short and pithy and to the point without repeating any information. Some bylaws do get published under, say, a local authority notice or provincial notice sometimes with a number, but because that's done so inconsistently, we kind of disregard that when generating the URIs, because we want to be able, again, to do that in a consistent way. One exception to repeating information from the rest of the URI in the number is if it wouldn't make sense not to include it. So for these rules of procedure of the Commission on Human and People's Rights, we don't repeat the African Commission on Human and People's Rights because that's the author. And we wouldn't normally repeat rules, but because procedure wouldn't make sense by itself, we include rules of procedure. For the OAU charter, we could have used OAU-charter as a number, but because they're both already included, we just went with NN for that one, which is the last line fallback for when there's no number according to the existing convention. And And so I touched briefly on when something doesn't get included here with the chapter numbers. But when we can include extra information, we do. So for these supplementary acts in ECOWAS, their existing naming convention includes the month in the document reference. So because we always have the month available, we do include it. And similarly, for this recommendation from the AU, they include the session as well as the recommendation number in their naming convention. So the recommendation numbers are already unique, in fact, so we don't need to include the session number, but because it's how they're used to seeing them, we try to incorporate as many elements from the existing naming conventions into the URIs that we generate. So here we would, in both cases, include the less specific information first, so the month, because that might repeat, and the session number might repeat, so we'll include that first, with the most specific, truly unique information right at the end, which follows the rest of the pattern of the URI. Cool, that's me. Sorry, I went a little over time, but yeah.
Thank you so much. So thank you for these analysis. Probably there is something to investigate. So I'm wondering if in the case of Namibia, if I understood well of the chapter 75, do you intend to use the family portion, so the element portion, because chapter 75 is a portion of the whole document, if I understood well?
Oh, no, it's not a portion. It was assigned a chapter number as the act reference.
Okay.
So
okay.
We just don't know what the original number of it was.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Sure. Yes, it is a naming convention of the naming called chapter in the Code of Law. Yes, it's a book of law. In the book of law of the chapter classifications. Okay. Thank you. And another question is, can you disseminate these, in your opinion, in each country as a best practice? So what is also the policy intent and goal? So to disseminate, to support the dissemination of AkomaNtoso, and especially starting from URI to each country. So is your goal also to create a sort of de facto standard for Africa, and that each country can adopt?
Right. So that's part of why we wrote the recommendation, is so that there is something, at least a starting point for everyone to look at, to get us all on the same page. We do partner with governments, and obviously when we do, we use not only the naming convention, we do the whole thing. So all the legislation marked up, or case law in Kenya as well now, marked up in AKN, and using the AKN FRBR URIs as well.
Okay.
Yeah, we do imagine that there will be other organizations also entering this space who aren't necessarily governments, but have similar purposes to ours, and we also want to help get them up to speed as quickly as possible. So yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think it's a very important initiative for supporting the digitalization in several countries of Africa. Thank you for your job.